F.W. Boreham lamented that he wasn't able to have a private school education. He described his own education as unvarnished. He attended the Grosvenor United School, a small school headed by a headmaster, Mr. T.S. Thorne, of whom Boreham said, "He took an intense personal interest in his pupils, to the extent that he was able to drive the young Boreham to be 2 to 3 years ahead of other children his age."
In fact, it was Boreham's giftedness and natural ability that saw him graduate from high school just before the age of 14. He was already a lover of books and read very well, but it was Gilbert Finch that he says gave him a love for books, particularly adventure books.
He taught me to love books, and during the dinner hour, on a day when it was too wet to play, he took me to a dingy little schoolroom a few streets away, where, in return for a modest outlay of a penny that a month, I could borrow as many tales of adventure as I could manage to devour. I wondered whether, in the entire history of finance, one solitary copper coin was ever made to go so far.
Francis Boreham, F.W. Boreham's father, was concerned with his son's unmixed diet of adventure books. Francis introduced his son to books from what he described as a more sedate library. This was when F.W. Boreham was introduced to biographies. His father brought home a copy of The Life of George Moore by Samuel Smiles.
I glanced through it, but I could see no sign of shipwreck or slave raid or a scalp hunt anywhere. I read the ponderous volume from cover to cover, and to my astonishment, it filled me with a delight of which, in anticipation, I'd never dreamed. I owe to that childish experience a penchant for biography that has deepened rather than evaporated with the years.
Boreham's insatiable hunger to learn was satisfied by enrolling in night classes at the Tunbridge Wells Mechanics Institute. He took every class offered and succeeded at all but one, drawing.
Boreham describes himself as an utterly hopeless drawer. He said that years later he was undertaking a lecture on the great missionary Robert Moffat.
There's a great story of him putting together a picture of Robert Moffat, who was a missionary at that time.
Only wise men learn from experience. I had undertaken to lecture in a small country chapel on Robert Moffat. It occurred to me that a picture of the missionary would greatly assist the effect of the lecture. Nowhere could I find one. In the biography that I had so carefully studied, there was a small engraving, but this was too insignificant to be of any use. Oh, and then came a brainwave. Why not draw a life-size portrait from this tiny one? I bought the parchment, set to work, and not to put too fine a point upon it, was more than pleased with the result. And on the day of the lecture, I took my masterpiece to the chapel and hung it just above the pulpit. I liked the look of it, and before leaving the building, I again surveyed it with pride from the porch. And then, emerging onto the village green, I chanced to encounter a young lady in whose aesthetic and artistic taste I had implicit confidence. I explained the reason for my visit to the chapel at that most unusual hour, and begged her to return and inspect my handiwork. A few minutes later, we were standing side by side in the aisle, examining the sketch over the pulpit. Greatly daring, I asked her opinion. It should, she observed thoughtfully, be a very valuable picture. This completely took my breath away. I had fondly hoped that with characteristic courtesy and charity she might perhaps say that it would answer to its purpose, but a very valuable picture? I'd never dreamed of so dazzling a bouquet.
And Boreham initially was quite chuffed by that response, and when he asked her why it was going to be so valuable.
And may I ask, I resumed in the moment of my elation, why do you think it's so valuable? Well, you see, she replied, with a charming smile, you happen this evening to be lecturing on Robert Moffat, but in the days to come, you may find yourself lecturing on other men, and that, she continued, glancing at my picture, would fit any conceivable occasion.
So I guess it just proves that we've all got our strengths and weaknesses, that particular story.
I felt that no punishment could be too severe for a young lady who could be guilty of such cold-blooded cruelty. So, later on, I married her. But that's another story.